My fiancée slept with my best friend during our engagement, so I ended everything publicly and made sure they would never recover from betrayal. I'm a 28-year-old guy, and for most of my life, I believed loyalty and trust were the foundation of any relationship. When I met Sophie 3 years ago, she immediately struck me as ambitious, magnetic, and sharp, a kind of energy I'd never felt before. She had this way of lighting up a room, while somehow making you feel like you were the only person that mattered. But she was also brutally honest about her struggles, constantly reminding me how underpaid she was, and how much she wanted to climb the ladder in her career. I swear, this project could change everything, but I just need a little breathing room, she'd say, flashing that half smile that made me believe her every time. I wanted to be her safety net, the steady hand she could rely on. And honestly, it never felt like a burden. It felt like love. By the time we got engaged, I was handling most of the engagement expenses, the apartment upgrades, the ring, dinners, and even half the planning. Sophie insisted I shouldn't stress, that her career would pay off soon, and that this was just temporary. I'd spend evenings balancing bills and spreadsheets, thinking about the life we were building. Love to me had always meant patience, trust, and supporting someone through the rough patches, no matter how much it cost me emotionally or financially. But small tensions started cropping up. When my friends came over, Sophie would glance around and mutter, "Wow, your friends are kind of boring, aren't they?" Or when my parents visited, she'd laugh softly. "I feel like I've stepped back in time. They're so old-fashioned." At first, I laughed it off, telling myself she was just trying to be funny, that it was her personality, nothing serious. Deep down, though, I noticed that subtle edge, the way she looked at my world like it wasn't enough for her. Despite the little digs, I felt proud. Proud that I was providing, that I was supporting someone I loved, that I could make life easier for her. I didn't know it yet, but while I was building a life with trust and care, cracks were quietly forming beneath the surface. Cracks I couldn't see. Cracks that would soon turn into a chasm I wasn't ready for. Things started getting harder to ignore a few months after the engagement. I began noticing Sophie growing unusually protective over her phone. It wasn't just the occasional glance to check a notification. She'd hide it when I walked by, swipe it down quickly, sometimes even laugh softly at messages she'd delete before I could see. At first, I told myself I was imagining things. She's just private, I rationalized, even though that little knot in my chest refused to go away. Then there was Jake, my best friend since college. The guy I trusted with everything, the one who had seen me at my lowest, who I thought would never betray me. Lately, though, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off whenever he and Sophie were in the same room. Laughing a little too long at each other's jokes, brushing hands accidentally on purpose, lingering glances that made my stomach turn. Friends started dropping subtle hints, joking about how Sophie and Jake are basically glued together, and I laughed nervously, masking the growing pit of unease in my gut. Every time I brought it up casually, Sophie would brush it off with that familiar half smile. "You worry too much," she'd say, placing her hand lightly over mine, softening the words with warmth I desperately wanted to trust. I wanted to trust it so badly that I ignored the subtle alarm bells ringing in my head. I kept paying the bills, covering dinners, planning trips, thinking I was building the perfect foundation for our future. But the atmosphere was changing. The apartment, once warm and filled with laughter, now felt layered with tension. I could feel it in the way they exchanged secret smiles across the room, in the way Sophie's tone subtly shifted when I entered a conversation. I told myself it was paranoia, but deep down, I knew something was brewing, something that would shatter the life I thought I was creating. And yet, I clung to trust, to loyalty, hoping this unease was nothing more than a passing storm. But storms have a way of breaking what you never thought could fall. The engagement party should have been a celebration, but from the moment we arrived, I felt it. A subtle, heavy tension that I couldn't shake. Sophie was radiant, laughing and charming everyone in the room, but there was a stiffness in her smile when she looked at me. She had this way of lighting up the room while simultaneously making me feel like I was on the outside, watching. Jake was there too, and the way he hovered around her made my chest tighten. They whispered and laughed together, just slightly too long, just slightly too close. Every time I tried to join the conversation, Sophie would glance at me, flashing that reassuring half-smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. During dinner, I noticed them exchanging those little secret looks again. A flicker of a smile, a shared joke whispered under the table. It was subtle, almost invisible if you weren't paying attention, but my heart sank each time. I wanted to confront it, to demand the truth, but something in me, hope, trust, denial, whatever you call it, kept me frozen. I kept telling myself I was imagining things. Friends made offhand comments that day too, like, "Man, Jake and Sophie are really clicking tonight," or, "Wow, they're basically inseparable, huh?" I laughed awkwardly, covering my unease with forced jokes, but the pit in my stomach only grew. The room that should have been filled with warmth felt suffocating, almost electric with tension. I could feel the cracks widening beneath the surface, but I had no proof yet. Nothing I could hold on to justify the sinking feeling in my chest. Sophie was charming, my best friend was loyal, and I was stuck in this impossible limbo of suspicion and love. I wanted so badly to believe they wouldn't betray me, that my trust wasn't misplaced. By the end of the night, I left the party feeling proud of myself for holding it together, for being the perfect fiancé, even as doubt gnawed at me from the inside. I didn't know it yet, but that party was just the tip of the iceberg, the calm before a storm that would change everything. It hit me like a punch to the gut, the night I stumbled across the messages. I had gone to grab my laptop for work, and there it was, a conversation between Sophie and Jake that made my blood run cold. At first, I thought it couldn't be real. I stared at the screen, rereading lines that were explicit, intimate, and undeniable. My hands trembled as my heart pounded, each beat hammering in my ears. How could they? My fiancé, the woman I trusted with my life, and my best friend, the guy who swore he'd always have my back. It was like watching the foundations of my world crumble in slow motion. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it might be some kind of sick joke, a misunderstanding. But the messages were too detailed, too specific to be anything but truth. I confronted Sophie that night, my voice shaking. "What is this? Explain yourself." She laughed nervously, brushing it off. "It's not what it looks like. You're overreacting." And Jake? He avoided my gaze, muttering something about being out of line. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to feel something, besides the raw ache in my chest. My apartment, once warm and safe, felt suffocating, the air thick with betrayal. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of cars passing outside, and it all mocked me, the ordinary world continuing while mine was imploding. I spent the night awake, scrolling through the proof again and again, each message twisting the knife further. I felt betrayed, humiliated, and powerless all at once. The people I loved and trusted most had crossed a line I didn't think even existed. By the morning, denial was gone. The truth hit me fully. Sophie and Jake had been lying, manipulating, and hiding this betrayal from me for months. My stomach churned with rage and heartbreak, But somewhere under it all, a dark thought formed. I couldn't let this slide. Something had to be done. And I knew, deep down, the moment of reckoning was coming sooner than they expected. After that night, something inside me shifted. The heartbreak was still raw, a dull ache that throbbed with every thought of them, but anger started to creep in, sharp and focused. I realized I couldn't just sit here and let Sophie and Jake get away with it, not after everything I had trusted them with. That's when the idea hit me. If they wanted to betray me in secret, I'd expose them in public. I'd make sure everyone who mattered saw the truth, and they'd feel the consequences they had earned. I started quietly gathering evidence. Screenshots, timestamps, messages. They were meticulous records of months of lies. I replayed conversations in my head, noting the moments when I had brushed off warning signs, each memory fueling a cold, precise determination. I told myself this wasn't about revenge for the sake of revenge. It was about reclaiming my power, restoring my dignity, and making sure they couldn't walk away unscathed. Friends started noticing a change in me. "You seem different," one said cautiously. I smiled politely, masking the storm behind my calm exterior. Inside, I was plotting every step, imagining the look on Sophie and Jake's faces when they realized their world was about to unravel. I envisioned the engagement party, the people who loved and trusted me witnessing the betrayal firsthand, the shock, the shame. The tension in the apartment became electric. Sophie sensed something too. I caught her staring at me with suspicion, trying to read my expression, but I didn't give anything away. Jake's confidence remained, though I could see the small cracks in his demeanor when he realized I was no longer naive. By the end of the week, my plan was solid. I felt a grim satisfaction as I imagined the moment of exposure, calm, collected, and in full control. For the first time since discovering their betrayal, I felt the scales tip back in my favor. But little did I know, the stage I had set would bring surprises I hadn't anticipated, twists that would push me further than I thought I could go. I knew I couldn't do this alone. Even though the plan was mine, I needed allies who understood the gravity of what Sophie and Jake had done. So I confided in a few close friends, the ones I knew would be honest and stand by me. "You need to be careful," one warned, leaning back in his chair. "Don't act impulsively. Make it clean, calculated. Public exposure, yes, but make sure it hits them where it hurts, socially, reputationally. Don't let your emotions wreck your plan." Their words sank in. I realized I wasn't just angry anymore. I was meticulous now. Every move had to be deliberate. I began rehearsing conversations in my head, imagining Sophie trying to spin her lies, Jake fumbling for excuses, and the audience, friends, family, colleagues, watching it all unravel. The thought of seeing the guilt and shame on their faces made my pulse quicken, but it also kept me calm. I had to control my own reactions, or all my effort would be wasted. The apartment felt different these days. The same walls that had once been safe now echoed with tension. Sophie noticed it too. She started glancing at me more often, trying to detect what I was planning. Jake, on the other hand, seemed oblivious, which only made my plan sweeter. I spent nights double-checking evidence, arranging timestamps, and making sure I had everything documented. And while I was consumed with strategy, I couldn't ignore the emotional weight pressing on me. Anger, betrayal, and heartbreak were still there, simmering under the surface. Every time I thought about the life I had envisioned with Sophie, I felt a pang of loss. But I buried it under determination. By the end of the week, I had everything mapped out. My friends nodded in approval as I ran them through the plan, a grim satisfaction settling in me. Sophie and Jake had no idea what was coming, and soon, The veil of their deception would be ripped away completely. Sophie started noticing the shift in me, though I kept my cool. Her once charming smile now faltered when she caught my gaze lingering too long. "You've been acting different," she said one evening, trying to sound casual as she stirred her coffee. "Are you upset about something?" Her tone was light, but I could hear the nervous edge beneath it. I just shrugged, letting the silence fill the room. That was enough to make her squirm. Jake was even worse. He still acted confident, like nothing was wrong, like I was the crazy one overreacting. But there were cracks, tiny ones, hesitant pauses, slightly forced laughter, that flicker of worry in his eyes whenever Sophie looked at me. The more I observed them, the more I realized how comfortable they had become with deception, thinking I was too naive to notice. And maybe, for a moment, I had been. I wrestled with my emotions constantly. I wanted to scream, to confront them in private, to demand answers. But I knew that would ruin everything. The confrontation had to be public, undeniable, with no chance for them to spin it. I couldn't allow emotion to blind me. This had to be precise, surgical, and devastating. Tension crackled around us in everyday life. Sophie's attempts at normalcy, laughing at jokes, casual touches, shared glances, felt hollow and manipulative. I could feel her panic simmering under the surface, like she knew something was coming, but had no idea what. Jake, on the other hand, continued to play the role of oblivious friend, making small talk and laughing too loudly at things that weren't funny. By the end of the week, the pressure was almost unbearable. Every interaction, every glance, every message felt like a ticking clock, counting down to exposure. I knew the engagement party was going to be the perfect stage, and the day I had been planning in my mind for weeks was finally within reach. Sophie and Jake had no idea the storm about to hit them. The engagement dinner arrived, and I could feel the weight of every step I took. The room was filled with friends, family, and familiar faces. The kind who had cheered me on, celebrated milestones with me, and unknowingly would witness the unraveling of two people I once trusted. Sophie was radiant as ever, chatting and laughing, her eyes occasionally darting toward me with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Jake hovered, nearby, trying to act casual, his grin just a little too tight, his movements too deliberate. Every detail I had planned, the timing, the audience, the evidence, was locked in my mind like clockwork. The apartment, once cozy and warm, now felt like a stage. I could hear the clink of silverware, the low hum of conversation, the faint scent of roasted chicken mingling with tension thick enough to choke on. I watched Sophie as she sipped her wine, pretending all was normal, and Jake leaning a little too close, laughing just a bit too loudly. My stomach twisted with anticipation, a mixture of fear and satisfaction bubbling beneath the surface. I reminded myself to stay calm, to speak slowly, and to let the evidence speak louder than my emotions. I had rehearsed this moment over and over, picturing the exact way I would reveal the messages, the screenshots, the undeniable proof of months of betrayal. My hands rested lightly on the table, masking the trembling I felt inside. Guests were unaware, chatting about banal things, completely oblivious to the storm about to descend. I could feel Sophie's gaze flicker to mine one last time, as if sensing something, but unable to identify it. Every second stretched endlessly. I caught Jake glancing at her, then back at me, a flicker of doubt flashing across his face. I knew he could feel it, the inevitable collapse of the comfortable lie they had built together. And yet, I stayed silent, letting the suspense build, letting the tension tighten like a rope around their necks. In that moment, I realized just how powerful this was going to feel, not just for me, but for everyone who had believed in me, and for the two people who had thought they could betray me without consequences. I finally stood, clearing my throat so everyone's attention shifted to me. The chatter died down, replaced by curious glances, subtle nudges, and a few questioning smiles. Sophie's eyes widened slightly, panic flickering beneath her composed mask. Jake shifted in his seat, trying to look casual, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched. I took a deep breath and let the first screenshot glow on my phone screen, projecting it to the people around the table. "This," I said, voice steady but cold, "is what I discovered last week." I tapped through the messages, one after another, each more explicit than the last. Gasps spread through the room. I could feel the weight of every stare, every whisper, settling on Sophie and Jake like a physical force. Months of lies, secrets, betrayal. The person I trusted most, and my best friend, thought they could get away with it. I watched Sophie's lips quiver as she tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Jake's hands shook slightly, the confident facade crumbling. People leaned in, murmuring, asking questions, staring in disbelief. "I can't believe you do this," I said, voice shaking slightly now, not with fear, but with righteous anger. "I loved you, Sophie, and you threw it all away for what? A cheap thrill with my best friend?" Sophie's face drained of color. Jake opened his mouth, trying to explain, but I cut him off, calm, deliberate, methodical. "There's nothing to explain. The evidence is right here, and everyone can see it." The room was silent, heavy, suffocating. The kind of silence that only comes when trust is shattered publicly. I felt a strange cold satisfaction settle in me, knowing the betrayal had been fully exposed, witnessed by everyone who mattered. Sophie's shoulders slumped. Jake's grin was gone, replaced by guilt and fear. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't just revenge. This was justice. But even as relief washed over me, a part of me knew the hardest battles, the aftermath, the fallout, were still ahead. After the confrontation, I expected relief, closure, maybe even a sense of victory. But what hit me instead was emptiness. The apartment was quiet, eerily quiet, and for the first time in weeks, the adrenaline drained from my body, leaving me hollow. I sank onto the couch, staring at the floor, the weight of everything crashing down. Months of trust, love, and friendship had been shattered, and the reality of it settled in like a lead blanket. I couldn't believe I had shared my life, my future, with people capable of this level of betrayal. The sound of my own breathing felt deafening in the silence. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the soft ticking of the clock on the wall, they all mocked me in a way I couldn't shake. I thought about Sophie, her laughter, the way I had imagined building a future together, and how easily it had been destroyed. I thought about Jake, my best friend, the person I'd confided in, celebrated with, trusted more than anyone, and now, I couldn't even look at him without feeling bile rise in my throat. Friends called later that evening, checking in, but their words couldn't fill the void. I tried to explain the weight of what had happened, but every sentence sounded hollow. The world had moved on around me, ordinary noises continuing as if nothing catastrophic had just occurred in my life. I felt isolated, humiliated, and completely alone in a way that no confrontation or revenge could fix immediately. I replayed the entire scene over and over in my mind, seeing their faces, hearing the gasps, feeling the room's tension again. And yet, despite exposing them, I realized that victory felt empty. The betrayal had cut so deep that even public humiliation couldn't undo the pain, couldn't restore the trust I'd lost. By the end of the night, I was exhausted, emotionally drained, and questioning everything I thought I knew about people I loved. And in that darkness, I felt something shift. The first seed of resolve, the ember of a plan to rebuild, reclaim, and ensure they could never hurt me again. After the initial shock wore off, I realized exposing them publicly was only the first step. If I truly wanted justice and closure, I had to ensure Sophie and Jake faced lasting consequences. I began carefully plotting my moves, thinking strategically about how to make their lives as uncomfortable and public as their betrayal had been to me. It wasn't about cruelty, it was about accountability, and I was determined to see it through. I started small, discreetly letting mutual friends know the truth, making sure they had context and evidence. The gossip spread naturally, but subtly, enough that it would reach workplaces and social circles without me needing to lift a finger. I documented every interaction, keeping a meticulous record so there would be no room for lies or spin. The thrill of seeing the scales finally tip in my favor was quiet, cold, and satisfying in a way that anger never could match. Sophie struggled to maintain her charm, but the cracks were undeniable. Invitations dried up, colleagues whispered behind her back, and her reputation began to erode. Jake's confidence, once so unshakable, faltered under the weight of judgment and exposure. Their mutual reliance, the bond they had thought unbreakable, started to crumble. And through it all, I remained calm, composed, the eye of the storm. I didn't gloat, I didn't lash out. I simply let the truth, the evidence, and the consequences do the work for me. Watching them scramble, struggling to regain control of a world they had underestimated, gave me a quiet satisfaction that was far more potent than vengeance. By the end of the week, I felt an odd sense of peace. I wasn't just reclaiming my dignity, I was proving something to myself, that I could survive betrayal, heartbreak, and humiliation, and come out stronger. The balance had shifted. Sophie and Jake were reeling, and I, finally, had regained control of my life. Weeks later, the storm had passed, and for the first time, I felt a strange, liberating calm. Sophie and Jake were still reeling, dealing with the fallout of their actions. Strained relationships, whispered gossip, opportunities slipping away, all consequences I hadn't needed to force, just expose. And me? I finally let myself breathe. The weight of betrayal, heartbreak, and humiliation that had pressed on my chest for months was lifting. I realized I hadn't just survived. It was more than survival. I had reclaimed my life, my power, and my dignity. I spent the next days reconnecting with friends and family, people I had feared would judge me or turn away. Instead, they offered support, understanding, and, in many ways, quiet admiration for the way I handled everything. I could finally laugh again, sleep without tension twisting my stomach, and envision a future without the shadow of Sophie and Jake lurking over it. It wasn't revenge in the petty sense. It was justice, accountability, and closure wrapped into one. I thought about the lessons I'd learned. Trust is precious. Loyalty can be taken for granted, and people can be cruel in ways you never expect. But I also realized resilience is just as powerful. Pain, betrayal, heartbreak. They don't have to define you. They can teach you, forge you, make you stronger than you were before. And I felt that strength now, deep in my bones. Standing in my apartment one quiet evening, I looked around, finally able to appreciate the life I had fought to reclaim. The silence was no longer suffocating. It was peaceful. The future was mine again, full of potential and free from toxic shadows. I didn't need Sophie or Jake to validate my worth anymore. For the first time in months, I smiled without guilt, without hesitation. I had survived betrayal, expose the truth, and emerge stronger, wiser, and empowered. And as I closed the door behind me that night, I knew this was the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter I controlled completely.